Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this edition of Citizen Voice. We have a special guest today, William J. Federer, and we're going to be interviewing him a little bit later. We want to thank you for tuning in, taking time from your busy day, busy schedule to check out Citizen Voice. And what we are trying to do essentially is teach true U.S. history. And if you remember, the specific point of getting this whole project started was to confront the misconception or the deception of the 1619 project that was launched by the New York Times. The thing is that William Federer has an extensive knowledge of history, and specifically here in the Jamestown colony, which we've been focusing on for the past few weeks here. If you remember from the last episode, what we were talking about was John Smith and how there were different things that weren't taught in your history courses about John Smith and also the Indian community. And one of the things that we ended on was Pocahontas saving John Smith and the marriage of Pocahontas to John Rolfe. Now, if that would not indicate no racism, it's hard to believe, what would. You have a person who is in the House of Burgesses marrying an Indian princess. So racism didn't enter into that picture. Indians and white people shared in that wedding at that point in time. Today, we're going to zero in on slavery. We're going to zero in on the aspect that the 1619 project makes a big deal about. I have this flyer here. By 1609, there was an adequate effort being made in Jamestown, but people were they were starving because they weren't planting or the crops didn't work. They had a number of different issues that they did not like. Some of them did not want to work. Some of them had problems with the heavy duty administrative hand upon them. It was Captain John Smith was pretty much a taskmaster. And another thing that I mentioned in the last episode was that the Virginia Company didn't plan for everything. And a lot of people discovered that afterwards, after they actually were there in the New World. But one of the things that they did do is they created the foundation for indentured servitude. And this is a situation, and we'll also explore this with Bill Federer. But the thing is that the indentured servants were white people. They were from, Europe, not from Africa. And it's likely that the majority of the settlers were indentured servants at one point in time. They're trying to get freedom to come to the new land and basically settle here, have a new start. They would be indentured for periods of 5 to 7 years. In Maryland, they allowed people to have a plot of land of about 50 acres so that, when they got into the situation, they had to stick it out. Otherwise, they would run away. And there were penalties for running away from indentured servitude. So the overall situation, you have people who are under the control of the Virginia Company. They made a contract, and it was an actual contract. But later, in the time of 1619, things began to change. The Virginia Company wanted to start introducing English common law into the colonies, and we get the House of Burgesses established. And this is the period of time that we want to take a look at with William Federer, because he has a very clear understanding of this period of time. He's a historian, and Nicole Hannah Jones is a journalist. The overall situation is that, she's writing from a journalistic perspective about something that she did not really adequately understand from a historical point of view. This is why we want to have William Federer on today, to try to get more clear about this period and to kind of differentiate the disillusionment that this whole project has created. There's a lot of misinformation, which is basically mistaken information, and there's a lot of disinformation, which is basically done deliberately. So we want to talk about this. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome William J. Federer. He's the author of several books. I actually used one of his books myself to do my own research and try to understand some of the things. It's an incredible, this is I would just say that this is an incredible book. There's so many quotations. It's an encyclopedia of quotations. It's basically called America's God and Country, but there's so much there. He's compacted so much in this book, but there are several books that he's written. One of the things that I really like about William Federer is because, a lot of historians write about history and they just, have a book and they stick it up in, a library somewhere, and then people never read it. If they do read it, they maybe forget about it. William Federer is out there in front of people talking about American history every day. And he's also not afraid to talk about God's intervention in American history. This is really one of the reasons why I'm a fan. And it's our honor to have William Federer on our program today. So, Bill, could you help us with the 1619 realm there and give us a little bit more clarity? We know that slavery came supposedly from a Dutch ship, and they sold a few slaves to the governor of the colony at that point. But we need a little bit more information, sir. And I hope that you can help us.
Sure. When we talk slavery, we go all the way back to Hammurabi's Code, 1800 BC, and he has kings, and the next class is military, next class is merchants, next class is poor farmers, next class is slaves. And the slaves didn't have the same rights as the rest, and that helped establish slavery in following civilizations. The Greeks had slaves. They were mostly captured in war. About 40% of Athens was slaves. Rome, they captured so many people throughout Europe, even Julius Caesar. The Eastern Europeans were called Slavs, like Yugoslav, Czechoslovakia, and they would bring them into Rome and give them away as permanent servants. And so the word Slav got the connotation of a permanent servant. Of course, we pronounce it today slave. And then you have Islam comes along. And Muhammad owned slaves. Muhammad owned African slaves. There's even a surah, 3350 or whatever, and it says, Allah has given you the slave girls as your booty. And so Muhammad and the Muslims would raid caravans, and then they would later raid ships, and they would raid the coast of Europe. And so in 846 AD, 11,000 Muslim pirates invaded Rome, Italy. And they carried away hundreds as slaves, and they trashed the Basilica of St. Peter's, and they trashed the bones of St. Peter and St. Paul. It was after that that Pope Leo decided to build a 39-foot wall around the Vatican. It's still there to this day. And so there were entire Catholic orders in Europe called the Trinitarians. They would raise money and go to North Africa to ransom back your friend who was a galley slave on a Muslim ship. One of the people was Vincent de Paul. And he was captured, made a slave in Muslim Constantinople. He witnessed to one of his master's wives, and she converted and convinced her husband to let him go. He goes back to Europe, and he starts hospitals, and he raises money to ransom galley slaves. And that was in the year 1607. What else happened in 1607? Jamestown was founded. And John Smith, in about 1600, he left England, went to Serbia and Hungary, and he fought the Muslims who were invading. It's called the Long War. And John Smith was captured, and he was made a slave. He was a slave in Constantinople. And one day his master was beating him, and nobody was around. So he killed his master, dressed himself in his master's clothes, hid his body under some straw, rode off on the master's horse, made it to Russia. And they took the iron ring off his neck, and he made his way back to Poland and Eastern Europe, and then he fought the Muslims on the Mediterranean. Finally, makes his way back to England in 1605. He actually gets a coat of arms with 3 Muslim heads chopped off with turbans because he defeated them in battle. And so it was after that that John Smith was chosen to help found the colony of Jamestown, Virginia. And so Captain John Smith himself had been a slave and escaped. Now, the Muslims enslaved an estimated 180 million Africans. They would castrate the men, make them eunuchs, sell the women into the sex trafficking, and they sold them from Timbuktu, where the canoe meets the caravan, the Niger River, Khartoum in southern Sudan, Madagascar, the Zanzibar coast, Tanzania. These were all Muslim slave markets selling Africans.
We have a slide on that, Spencer.
And so then you had these, when Columbus discovers the New World, the Spaniards begin to enslave Native Americans. And a Catholic priest named Bartolome de las Casas spends his whole life, and he finally convinces the King of Spain to outlaw the enslavement of Native Americans. It's great, except the greedy people say, where can we get more slaves? And someone said, Africa. And so that's when the Spanish, followed by the Portuguese, began to go to the Muslim slave markets and buy Africans. And so what would happen is you'd have tribes like the Ashanti tribe that would attack other African tribes and sell them into slavery. This continued for centuries. Even David Livingstone, the Scottish missionary to the Congo in the 1800s, would write about stumbling across a line of Africans chained and being forced to march 500 miles to the coast to be sold into Muslim slavery. And he said, if anything in my travels and exploration can help get rid of this monster that hangs over Africa of the Muslim Arab slave trade. And there's only one word in Arabic for African and slave. It's the same word, abid. So every black person they would call a slave. So they began to sell them to the New World. And it's sad that the Portuguese and Spanish, followed by Dutch and then French and English, participated in the slave trade. The King of England had the British East India Company and had the Virginia Company and then had the Royal African Company, where he was profiting off of the slave trade. But the abolitionist movement started, and it started with Christians. It started with Quakers, started with Methodists and Baptists, and they began to promote the abolition of slavery. So we're talking about in 1688 was the first petition by the Quakers to outlaw slavery in America. And this Christian movement ended up being where the Quakers started the first anti-slavery society in Philadelphia, and then Ben Franklin became the president of the first anti-slavery society in America. And then we had the Second Great Awakening revival, and the abolitionist movement grew. But that's getting ahead of the 1619. So you had...
Bill, I have a question about that. Did that start in England and then come over to the colonies, or did it start in the colonies and move back across the Atlantic?
Right. As far as the movement to get rid of slavery, it started in America.
It did.
It was right. So it was Germans.
We don't hear that. We don't hear that in history classes.
Right. German Quakers settled in Philadelphia, and there was one of them named Anthony Benezet. And he was a French Protestant Huguenot, flees to America, becomes a Quaker, and then he starts a school to teach Black children to read. And then he writes a book on the horrors of the slave trade. And this book is a bestseller. And the founding fathers begin to read it, like Patrick Henry. After he actually says, after reading Bezenet's book, he said, I can no longer defend slavery. And the next year, Patrick Henry introduced a bill to outlaw the importation of slaves into Virginia. And it passed. And then you had George Washington. The last 6 years of his life, he endeavored to turn his different farms from having slaves to hired labor. And then Marquis de Lafayette, he wanted to buy a island, Cayenne, a plantation there, and free the slaves. And so this was a movement. Richard Bassett signed that declaration, and he then converted, and he became a Methodist, and he freed all of his slaves. So this was a new movement. This was sort of like today, more and more people are becoming pro-life. They're, with the advances of science, they're seeing that yes, indeed, this is a brand new human being in this mother's body. It is not a part of the mother's body. It is a separate body inside of the mother's body. I know that's complicated for some people to understand, but this is the way all mammals come into existence, right? And so nowadays, more people, the statistics show more people are becoming pro-life. It was sort of like that back then, that more people...
I have a question about that. Wasn't that more or less the concept behind the idea of the slaves weren't truly human beings? And it's the same kind of argument with the abortion people today, that the fetus inside the womb, not the baby inside the womb, is not really a human being, right?
Yeah, now, and this goes back to Plato, Aristotle, Greece, where they thought the Greeks were superior and the other peoples were these barbarians and they were less than human, and it was okay to enslave them. And so you always see this where you would have the Japanese enslaving Koreans, and you would have different the Bantu tribes enslaving other tribes there in Africa. They would always consider one superior and the other inferior. And so, yes, the Indians, there were different Indian tribes in America that would enslave other Indian tribes.
Right.
And they would consider themselves ethnically superior to the ones that they had captured. So it's this common theme. So when the Spaniards first came over and began to set up their feudal system, and claim that all the natives on their land were their slaves and servants. There was a Spanish leader named Sepulveda, and he argued that the natives were not fully human, and therefore it was okay to enslave them. And Bartolome de las Casas actually had debates with Sepulveda, saying, no, these are fully human. They are just as human as you and me. If you read the debates of Bartolome de las Casas, it sounds like the pro-life debates today, right? The baby in the womb is a fully human being, has its own DNA, its own, fingerprints, its own, brain waves and so forth. And anyway, and the Nazis, the fascists in Italy, they would actually teach their version of critical race theory that the Jews were less than human. And so you read the accounts of people that grew up in Italy and had gone through this indoctrination, or they were the Hitler Youth. They literally thought that they were a superior race and that the Jews were an inferior race. Even after the war, some of them said it took them generations to finally realize, no, all the races are the same, right? And so this is a important concept. Hitler didn't want the Indian Jim Thorpe to get the gold medals because he figured, well, he's an American Indian. How can he defeat the superior Aryan race? And so anyway, but in America, you had the Spanish in the Americas. The Spanish were capturing and buying slaves from Africa and bringing them to the Caribbean, mostly to Brazil, and then to the Caribbean, and then a smaller percentage to North America. So the Dutch captured a Spanish ship and got these slaves, but the Dutch ship was running out of food, lands in Virginia, and says, we want to trade some of these slaves for food. And they were brought to America. Now, the original slaves were still treated under the indentured servant concept, where they worked and then were given freedom. And so one of those was Anthony Johnson, and he came as a slave to America in 1821. He worked his 7 years. He was freed. He bought land, and Anthony Johnson is considered the first Black man to own property in America. And he had a tobacco plantation, and he had slaves. There were 4 white slaves and 1 black slave named John Cassor. And after 7 years, John Cassor leaves and he starts working at another plantation. He figures, I did my 7 years, I'm gone. Well, Anthony Johnson brings a lawsuit in the Virginia legal system and wins. And he gets John Cassor brought back to his plantation and made a slave for life.
Let me ask you a question. You said 1821. Was that a misquote on the date, or is this further into the future then?
Right. So this is another slave. So 1619 was the very first ones that came off of that Dutch ship. But
so then, you're talking about future down the road here. This is a slave owner who he's a former slave, and he owns a black man, right? Is that correct? What I'm getting?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Now, you saw that some of the Indians would kidnap Americans and bring them into their tribe. You read stories of the little settlements, and then they would have little wars, battles with the Indians. And if an Indian was killed and they had captured a settler, the settler was supposed to take the dead Indians' place in the tribe, and they would assimilate them into the tribe. They were slaves, and of course, they would take them hundreds and hundreds of miles to the west, and then when the settlers captured some of the Indians, they would either enslave them or sell them into the West Indies. There was this continued. Even Lewis and Clark had Sacagawea, and she had been captured from another tribe and made basically a slave. And then that's when the Frenchman Charbonneau bought her, or won her in a fight or something. And so Sacagawea, that went with Lewis and Clark, she had been enslaved by one tribe from another tribe. The Cheyenne had gotten mastery of the horse. So the Spaniards left some horses that got wild, that multiplied, and the Cheyenne learned how to ride them, and they raided the other Plains Indians for an entire century before the British settled Jamestown. And so they would be killing and enslaving and wiping out other tribes. And so there's a long list of different tribes. You go down to the Aztecs, they would not only capture those from other tribes. One of the reasons that the Cortez was able to defeat the Aztec was because, number one, the other tribes helped Cortez because they were tired of getting their captives being taken and then brought to the top of their pyramid and having their hearts ripped out, still beating, and then they would let their bodies roll down and they would cannibalize them and eat them. People thought these were just made up stories by Cortez's men until just a few years ago. They were excavating under an old building in Mexico City, and they uncovered this theater. It was a semicircle that had thousands and thousands of human skulls. Mm-hmm. And it was exactly what Cortez's men had described. And many of them were infant skulls, so they were not taken in battle, but they were actually used in sacrifice. And then you had Atahualpa was the leader of Inca Peru. And they had a system where everybody in the nation was a slave, right? That every single person in the nation was under mandatory control of the Inca government. And Atahualpa claimed to be a delegate of the sun god.
Right.
And so that's why
I remember that they would actually take a whole tribe of people and move them from the coast up into the mountains and move the people from the mountains down to the coast, so they would completely be disoriented and it would be easier to control them.
Right. It was such a top-down society in the Inca Peru that when the Spaniards came, they had things that are pretty simple from our point of view. They had horses and they had steel swords, and they could read and write, so they could communicate. The Peruvians had no horses. They carried their leader on a litter. That's where you had a platform and you had a bunch of slaves that had the pole and lifted it on their shoulders, and they would carry them. And they couldn't read and write. They had a very rudimentary communication. And so it was a quick battle, and the Spaniards captured the leader. And when they put him in a room, demanded the room be filled up with gold and all that story. But the Spaniards took over the leadership, and the whole country had been trained to do what they're told. Mm-hmm. They didn't have any concept of the individual and you. And so that's why they were all easily put to work in the Potosi silver mines.
Kind of like what's happening right now under a certain administration in Washington, D.C. Bill, we have about 5 minutes left. We started a little bit late, but we're going to go, about 5 more minutes. And what I'm looking at is that there's this claim. There's a lot of intellectuals. There's some historians like Howard Zinn who use, history as a weapon. And this is one of the things that I dealt with when I first started this project. The concept of history as a weapon means that, the people who are the victims don't get to write history. But if you discount the Bible, which is a lot of stories about victims, they wrote the Bible, then you don't have that perception of people who are victims being able to speak up for themselves or write history. The whole concept behind the Bible is that people who were victims did speak up, and it was like God was working in what they were doing. There are a lot of people that buy into that theory. The other thing is that racism is something that was at the core of this. Based on an understanding of history, I don't think you come to that conclusion, correct? I mean, can you come to that conclusion?
Right. The movement to end slavery was started by Christians in America. It was not started by Muslims in Arabia. They still have slavery today.
Right.
It was not started in India, where they have the caste system, and the lowest of the caste, the untouchables, they're condemned to clean the sewers. And even if they're really good at it, they can never graduate and get out of that caste. In China, where you had 5,000 years of emperors, the bottom was the Jia Min, and they were the slaves. They were the base persons. They were the debtors, and they had no rights and no values. Egypt had slavery. Of course, they enslaved the Jews, but they put them to work building the pyramids. But this is something that continued. The movement to abolish slavery didn't come along until Christianity. Now, it began to eradicate slavery in Europe on a gradual basis because these kings and these kingdoms would gradually become Christian, and the idea of doing to others as you would have them do unto you. And then, like St. Vincent de Paul would start an order to collect alms and donations to ransom people out of slavery. There was another order called the Trinitarians. They would ransom people out. Miguel de Cervantes, who wrote Man of La Mancha, Don Quixote, he had been captured and made a slave, and it was this Catholic order of Trinitarians that ransomed him back. People forget the Pilgrims. In 1625, they had saved up 800 pounds of beaver skins, and they sent them to England, and they're in the English Channel when a Turkish man of war captures one of the ships, brings it down to Morocco, and sells the crew into slavery. The Sultan of Morocco was Moulay Ismail. He had 25,000 European slaves that he had captured with his pirates, and he had 1,000 wives or 500 wives that bore him 1,042 children. Supposedly that's some record, right? And Moulay Ismail was brutal. There's stories of him building Mekanez, his palace city, and he insisted that all the slaves hammer in unison. And if they weren't hammering in unison, he'd have them kicked off the wall. Just brutal. And it is sort of interesting that those that condemn slavery not only ignore these chapters of Islamic slavery, but they ignore slavery today. There's actually more slavery today than at any other time in world history. And a whole lot of it is in Muslim countries in Africa. We read stories of the Boko Haram Muslims of Nigeria going down to south and surrounding entire villages and taking all the children away and forcing them to convert to Islam and making them into little slave wives and so forth, because they could have young girls as forced wives. And then you have slavery in India. It's called the generational indebtedness, where it was this process where some family ancestor got in debt, and the debtor made them work on their farm to pay off the debt, and the debt obviously never got paid off and got passed on to the kids and the grandkids and the great grandkids, and it was this permanent servant working this land for this master that you could never do enough work to pay off. It's a kind of slavery. And then, of course, communist countries today, you look what they're doing. They don't just enslave people like the Uyghurs. They harvest their body parts, and sort of like Planned Parenthood today, selling body parts. But it's the human condition of sin. And I trace two threads through history: greed and the gospel. You always have people motivated by greed, and they're the ones that sell people into slavery and take land from Indians and grow opium in India and force it into China, right? Which the British did. But you always have people motivated by the gospel. And they're the ones like Bartolome de las Casas that spent his life to end the enslavement of Native Americans. And the people motivated by the gospel go to the African villages and dig wells and have medical clinics and free medical care and start schools to teach them so they can get a better life. And so it's a software problem, not a hardware problem. Imagine if I were to tell you green computers are better than red computers. You're like, really doesn't matter what color the computer is. What matters is what software is running on it. Right? It doesn't matter what color somebody's skin is. It's what's thinking is going on in their brain.
That's right.
Is it doing to others as you would have them do it to you, right? Or is it selfishness?
Right. It's a very similar concept to what Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. said, is that he defined racism as a disease of the human heart. And in reality, if we don't know how to love one another, we're going to be that way towards other people. We will choose to control them or enslave them in one way or another. How are we doing on time right now, Spencer? Are we we're done with time? I haven't got any time notation here. Bill, would you be able to stay around for question and answers if anybody is going to hang around on the call to answer some questions for them?
Sure.
Okay, very good. Do you have any final parting words for the audience? You know that we don't have a lot of time. We have a half an hour. I would advise people to go to Bill Federer's website. There's a number of books there. I showed you the one that I use more or less as my reference point, but there's a number there. Bill, would you like to have the final word here?
Sure. So you had the Second Great Awakening, and you had people becoming really on fire Christians, and that fueled a missionary movement around the world. It fueled the beginning of the YMCA and the Salvation Army and all these different groups, and it fueled the abolitionist movement. And so Charles Finney, one of the preachers of the Second Great Awakening, he became the president of Oberlin University, which graduated the first Black woman, Mary Patterson, and it was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And so you had the Democrats in the Deep South had slavery. And so they passed the Fugitive Slave Law. And so an escaped slave named Joshua Glover had escaped, came up to Wisconsin. And because of this fugitive slave law, he was arrested, put in prison. They were about to take him back to slavery. And 5,000 white people in Wisconsin stormed the jail and freed Joshua Glover. And just 2 days later, these people went to Ripon, Wisconsin, and formed a brand new political party to end slavery. It is called the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And Lincoln was the first Republican president. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Teddy Roosevelt, Republican president, had the first Black man in the White House for dinner as a guest, Booker T. Washington. You had Democrat President Woodrow Wilson segregate the federal offices and the military. And you had Republican Eisenhower integrate the military, and Eisenhower sent the federal troops to the South to stop Democrat George Wallace and to forcibly integrate the schools. And then you had LBJ do the big switch from intimidation to entitlement. So instead of the Democrat Party intimidating these blacks with the KKK and the Jim Crow laws and the black codes, LBJ switched it to the Great Society welfare state entitlement programs. And this idea that if you get people dependent on welfare, which and even if their families get destroyed, that's fine, because that'll be more people on welfare. And then their attitude was these will be permanent voters. LBJ also changed the immigration quotas, where most immigrants had come from Europe and they had a work ethic and they would not take welfare. He noticed that immigrants from third world countries would be happy to take welfare, and when they did, they would get dependent. I ask people
the invention of economic slavery. Very good.
Yeah. So I tell people, imagine if you were getting $1,000 check in the mail every week from someone you didn't know, week after week, $1,000, like clockwork. Would you wake up after a couple of years and ask yourself, who is sending me this $1,000 check? I'm going to find out who they are and vote them out of office.
Correct.
Would anybody do that?
Kind of like what the Biden administration is doing right now, it seems.
Yes, it's become a standard way to build a voter base for that particular party.
Bill, we're out of time, but you've taken us all over the world and deep in history and back to the present day again. So I would hope that we could invite you back that you would feel welcome on this program again.
Anytime.
We do have to curtail it at this point. I think we started late, but we went over. But thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. We really appreciate those who can take some time out of their busy day. Hopefully that you can do this again on a regular basis. Thank you for the sponsors, Citizen Sentinel Network newsletter and the Citizen Voice effort. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you again next week. Take care.